Good afternoon, everybody. It looks like we're still waiting on a couple of our registrants, so I'm going to give them a couple minutes and then we'll get started. All right, I don't see anybody else in the queue, so we'll go ahead and get started. Keep everybody's time in mind here this morning. Thank you all for joining us today. This is one of the last webinar series we have with NEDCC, so we've been really pleased to have them for this webinar series. Today, we will be talking about how to host a community scanning day. And I am going to introduce our speaker just a little bit, so you all have a little bit more background information about her. Eli is with the NEDCC Preservation Specialist, which provides consultations, training programs, assessments, and disaster assistance to cultural heritage organizations nationwide. She focuses on Midwest and the Southeast regions of the United States. So I did also send out a couple of PDFs this morning to all of our registrants. So you should have that in your inbox. If not, I'll also be sending them out again as a follow-up email with the recording of this session and a survey that NEDCC has provided for us. So I will go ahead and let Eli take over the presentation from here.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks everyone for coming today. I'm really excited to be here. I know that we've had, this is the last, I think there's one more webinar in our series, and so I'm excited to be your second to last one today. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Eli Boyne, and I'm a preservation specialist at NEDCC. I'm really excited to be able to present this webinar today, how to host a community scanning day. And so just before we get started, I wanted to ask a quick question, if everyone could just write in the chat. So, first off, we're talking about scanning today, and scanning might be a bit of a misnomer. Really we're talking about digitization, which can include or be limited to scanning, but there's other formats of that as well. And so before we get started, I was curious if people could write in the chat if you've done any digitization work at your institution before. And just wanted to let you know, as we go through the webinar today, I'll be using a few terms interchangeably. So I'll be saying digitization, reformatting, scanning. All of those are going to be pretty much meaning the same thing. So if you have done any digitization, great, John has, or if anyone else, just good to know. Oh, good. Okay, everyone has done some, so that's great. So hopefully some of this might be a little bit of review, but always happy to take any questions that you have. And if you do have any, feel free to ask those at the end of the webinar today. I'm also going to turn off my video camera so we can all focus on the slides here. Okay. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get started and take a look at today's agenda. And so I want to get everyone thinking about the elements of creating a community scanning day and then making and presenting collections with your community. And so a few things that we're going to be speaking about, first of all, are goals. And so what are the goals of your participants who are coming to your community scanning day? And then what are also your goals as the host of that day? No, I'm sorry, I'm gonna click that off there. Okay. Second, how are you going to meet those goals? And so, as we talk about some logistics and steps today, we're going to talk about useful forms to consider, as well as enlisting any kind of volunteers or colleagues in your departments or at your institutions. Also coming up with an order of operations. So step by step, how you will enact this. And then deciding what the deliverables of your scanning day will be, or in other words, what will your participants get to go home with, and what will you be producing as an institution from all the material you're able to gather during your scanning day. You may have already decided how you're going to complete the actual digitization that you'd be conducting, but we'll briefly run through some ideas for setting up and then selecting the tools that you'll need that can work best for your situation. We'll also be talking a bit today about access and delivery systems, or rather what happens with the scanned material after the event. And so, in other words, where will it live and how will it be used? And just a little bit about something that might be the elephant in the room, which are rights and privacy concerns. And so giving these a little thought ahead of time will really help avoid any issues about privacy or rights from the very beginning. And then finally, we have some resources available to help you plan and scale your community scanning day to suit your needs. And like Sarah mentioned, there will also be a resource PDF that she, I think, has sent to you, and will also send to you after our webinar today. So as we get started, we're going to go ahead and hop right into goals. And always a good place to begin, so we'll go ahead and start there. I know that I personally find it difficult to plan anything if I don't have an outcome in mind. And so by forming the goals of our community scanning day, we can better understand what steps we'll need to take to achieve them. And so first, let's talk about our participants or our contributors, really, what their needs are and what their expectations are. And so, for example, people who are coming to your event, they might want to have their personal items included in your collections. And also they very likely want to be represented as part of your community. And so from the start, let's be clear about what's happening with the digital copies of their things. And so will these materials be fully accessible online? Will there maybe be an online exhibit of these materials? Or perhaps the event will be self-contained and then end up being an online catalog of what was brought to the scanning day itself. And then also, maybe your participants will be able to take a copy of their digital file home with them, for instance, on a thumb drive, or maybe it's something that you can email to them. And so there's a variety of ways to add value to the participants' experience while they're at your event too. And so perhaps there can be a storytelling station where participants can talk about the item that they brought, or maybe they can also talk about the experience that they're having at scanning day itself. Your participants might also want the opportunity to talk to other members of their local cultural heritage community. And so that might be like-minded individuals or representative of organizations like libraries or historical societies. Next, we also need to consider our own goals as hosts of the community scanning day. And so how does the community content fit within the scope of your own collections? And how will you organize and store the new digital content that you'll be creating at this event? You might be thinking of the new content as part of your overall digital collections, or maybe, as we mentioned, as an event that's going to be displayed separately, either in your repository or on your website. You'll at least want to know how to organize and name those newly created files that you'll be making. And of course, with digital preservation, have a place to store them. And so it's quite possible that your ultimate goal really is to be involved in the community and capture a moment in time when everyone's sharing their stories and thinking about preserving their personal and collective histories. And so by hosting the event, you're communicating that you're invested in being stewards of your community's cultural heritage. As such, events like these are really a great opportunity to connect with your community and offer resources to them for caring for collections in an interactive and a participatory environment. But one question to ask that we see here with this slide is, why are we digitizing content at all? And what do we say in our program outreach to encourage people to come? And so as cultural stewards, we know that we digitize to save materials that are disappearing. And also the survival of many types of content depend on digitization. And so whether it's because it's a glass negative and it's difficult to view or risky to handle, like we see here in this slide here in this image, um, or maybe it's a really degraded photograph, we know that we're digitizing material so we can save it. And during an event like this, we're also using digitization to bring our community together and to learn from one another. And so instead of focusing on maybe the usual suspects in our collections, these can be things like politicians or institutional records or people who have had a outsized influence in culture in general. We're gathering the stories of regular people during an event like this. Or perhaps we're even creating a collection that captures the essence of what our lives are like today for the benefit of future generations. And so improving access is probably familiar to any one of you who does reference work or cultural heritage work. We know that everyone expects to be able to quickly access things digitally now. I'm sure this is something we probably all experienced during the pandemic. Some potential users of our collections, either maybe they don't want to travel to our institutions, or maybe they can't travel to our institutions just to see the materials there. And so they want us to email them a picture or just have our content available online. And so we, as advocates for cultural heritage materials, we really want to provide as much access to the collections that we have as possible. And so this provision of accessibility to personal collections, that might be something that's attractive to the participants of the scanning day too. And so not only can contributors access their own digitized materials online, and then also cut back on any excessive handling of their family heirlooms. They can also easily share these items with others and then have a larger presence in our collective history. And so we know why we want to digitize our collections, but we also need to select and prioritize which items to scan. And so this might seem obvious to those of us who are used to working with collections, but you want the participants to really think critically about what materials to bring and what would benefit most from digital access. And so if multiple people have copies of something, so maybe that's like a group photo for a social club, like we see here on the screen, you want to digitize what would be quote unquote the best one. And so this might mean the most original one or the one that's in the best condition. You also want to be clear about what you have the capacity to handle and are actually allowed to digitize. And so this is another thing that might seem fairly straightforward at first glance, but it doesn't hurt to be explicit about your limitations. And so maybe for your community scanning day, you want to limit formats in order to exclude large scrapbooks or three-dimensional items like clothing or textiles. It's always a really good rule to follow. Also think about whether you feel comfortable helping people with fragile items, or if it's better for them not to risk transporting things that are fragile to the event in the first place. You'd also do well to limit the total number of items each person can bring, making sure that you have time to work with each participant. And so there is an event that has happened in the past called the Mass Memories Roadshow. It's something that happened in Massachusetts and happened throughout the state. And you'll hear me referencing that a few more times today during our webinar. But Mass Memories Roadshow has a 3-item limit, for example. And so they ask their participants to only bring three materials. Again, speaking of Mass Memories Roadshow, they've developed some really clever workarounds to handle exceptions. And so, for instance, if you restrict things to just photographs or paper objects, at one of their events, a contributor showed up in costume, and that's something that he wished to be digitized. And so to handle that, they were able to document the person wearing the costume by photographing him at the event. And then they used those photos as the digitization of the costume. And so then all the associated information around that costume was captured, and then the photos were included in the online display. As I mentioned, you might choose to narrow down your selection even further, so to a single format. And that all depends on what you imagine for the day and what your own limitations are in terms of the equipment that you have to digitize materials. In case you want some specific guidance here, you're very likely going to want to avoid any deteriorated or fragile works, any light sensitive media like negatives, or any media requiring highly specialized equipment that can include things like AV or VHS. And of course, any moldy or infested works. You don't want people to bring anything that might, spread pest or mold in your collections. Okay, so as we've gone through our different goals and kind of a rough overview of how we can think about our community scanning day, um, we can think about the nitty-gritty details of the logistics of hosting one and how we can start to put the event together. And so, like any program, you're going to need to schedule an event like a community scanning day. You're going to need to schedule that out, likely well in advance, and determine an appropriate location to hold the event. And so the planning and the scheduling phase involves several people and usually takes quite a while. And so you really want to give yourself plenty of time for planning. You can put together an agenda for the event that includes the goals that we just discussed, and then make a schedule that you will then refine over time as things get more fleshed out. It will also be helpful to set some deadlines for major planning phases, like reserving the location, contacting any potential partners, getting your outreach materials ready, recruiting volunteers or staff to help with the event, and then training those volunteers and staff who will be helping and giving them the information they need to be able to work on the community scanning day with you. You'll also be needing to think about the more practical aspects of the event. And so think about whether you're going off-site, maybe into a specific community, or if you're hosting it at your own institution. And when you're considering that, make sure that you're going to have access to sturdy tables, convenient electrical outlets, and enough space for people to circulate and carry their items, as well as chairs for staff and participants alike. And then if you think of anything that's beyond what's listed here on the slide, and as we mentioned, these slides will be available to you. So you will be able to print these out and have these instructions with you or these ideas with you. But if you do think of anything beyond what's listed here, make sure that you write it down. And so the most obvious things are often the easiest to overlook, simply because often you think there's no way anyone could ever forget this. It can be kind of what we think of as the classic grocery list problem. And so if something's not on the list, it's also highly unlikely that it will make its way into your grocery basket. Also remember that there's going to be the inevitable hitch in setting up your equipment. And so it's worth it to set up early and check that everything is working as expected. And so to prepare for any kind of AV glitches or anything like that, you might even do a run through with staff and volunteers before the event officially begins. And so that's a great way to make sure everything is working and to get everyone on the same page as far as your order of operations, which we will discuss in just a moment. But first, I really want to stress the importance of capturing information about the contributors and the things that they've brought with them on a standardized form. And so this form will help with managing intellectual control of each scanned item and also connect it to the person who brought it. And so a form that you use should capture information like the creator of the item, the content, the type of material, and the dates which will keep digitized content pre-attributed and help with that file organization and metadata that you'll be assigning to it. You're also going to want to provide some internal tracking information to keep everything organized behind the scenes after the event. And so here we see on the screen a form from the Mass Memories Roadshow, and they developed this form shown here, and they have a lot of experience to inform what is on this. And so not only does this tool help us establish intellectual control of the items that we're scanning, but it also captures the story of each item directly from the person who brought it. And so the storytelling piece of Scanning Day is really key to community building and fostering participatory history. And so think again about the man in the costume that we discussed. The digitization of his costume really came together in the documentation of his story. And so this form that we just saw on that slide, it will become part of the order of operations during the event that I mentioned the order of operations that I've been mentioning as we go through the webinar today. It's really helpful for you and for the participants to have some guidance through the event. And so this helps with pacing and allows things to keep organized throughout the community scanning day. And so thinking of order of operations, you might have the participants start at a welcome and interview station where they're asked about themselves and what they brought, and essentially filling out the form that we just showed. And so this station welcomes them into the space and makes sure that you're able to record the information that you need for the event to be successful. It also, right off the bat, establishes that basis for intellectual control that you need to maintain. Thinking about the second step, the participant can then take their items in form to a scanning station and get their materials digitized. And so the scanning station can have a person doing the scanning and then another person naming the file, uploading it, and organizing the resulting files according to the information gathered in the form. And so if you're using a paper form, which might be the easiest way to track all these different materials coming through, you can scan it alongside the associated items that were brought and make a digital file folder for each contributor. And so a good tip here is to make an inventory of any needed supplies for each station, and then some instructions for those who are staffing those stations, and then perhaps designate a coordinator to make sure everything is in place between those two stations. And so beyond 2 or 3 stations, you can feel free to get creative with other activities. And so ones that we've heard about here at NEDCC include a photo booth, like maybe on the Antiques Roadshow, where people talk to the cameraman about their experience and what they brought. Or maybe there's experts who can be available to discuss collections or preservation or research. And so you might have a table where representatives of other organizations might be on hand to help out and engage with the community. And that will bring me to our next slide here. And so a community scanning day is really a great opportunity to collaborate with like-minded organizations. And so a historical society like I mentioned, they can maybe have their own table to meet the community and talk to potential new members. I have a colleague here at NEDCC who mentioned that he's assisted with community scanning days before, and he was able to participate during his participation, he was available to answer any questions about collections care during the event. And so if you're an organization that's hosting the event, you could also have a separate table to show the community what other types of services and programs you provide, and maybe a little bit more about caring for your materials at home. You could also have this event could also be an opportunity to do outreach for other programs that you think the participants of a community scanning day would enjoy. And speaking of outreach, it is the other component of logistics for putting together a community scanning day. And so we'll go ahead and move on to outreach here. And so as we know, outreach is an important component to any program that we host at our organization. And so thinking about that order of operations, I put this slide last or just thinking about logistics in general. I put this slide last because I think it's helpful to think about some of the previous logistics that you need to put together before knowing what to include in your outreach communications. And so once you've determined any kind of partnerships or collaborations for your day, you can then draft your advertisements for the event. And so if you put all of your advertisements together in one main design, you can use that on posters, flyers, postcards, and any online social media or banners that you might be using. One of the main things to think about for your community scanning day is really reaching a diverse representation of the community, since the whole point is to be inclusive and to gather the memories from your community itself. And so this might mean translating your marketing materials into other languages, or having a healthy social media presence where you're reaching a wide amount of people, or maybe even drafting some personal emails to your target audience. As you're thinking about your outreach and designing any kind of logos or advertisements, this might also be the time to make some signage to use for wayfinding during the event and help people understand those order of operations that you've determined. And so if you did design a logo, be that formal or not, again, it's nice to include that on all the communications and signage to have a nice unified look for the day. Again, thinking about setting item and material limits during your outreach and through advertising, make sure to be upfront about that as you're putting that material, you're conducting your outreach and putting that material out into the world. And so, you might say community scanning day, we're hosting it for photographs and paper documents, and just being really upfront about that, because otherwise you might end up with a dozen of people who have their jam-packed scrapbooks or fragile family heirlooms, or maybe less common formats that you're not prepared to digitize during your event. Okay, I'm going to take a quick drink of water here. So now we know our plan for the day and our general order of operations, but what about your actual digitization setup? And so you might have already decided what you'd like to do or know exactly what equipment that you have, but I'm going to run through some considerations for selecting equipment and then talk about 3 general setups that you can use for a community scanning day. And so each one, or maybe a combination of them, might be best for your situation based on the format of the materials that you expect to digitize, the scope of the event that you're creating, and of course on your budget. And so to pick the right tools for your community scanning day, you'll have to go back and think about the goals that we examined earlier that we spoke about at the beginning of the webinar. And so again, about both your goals as the host of the community scanning day, and then the participants' goals as contributors. And so you want to have an idea of the types of materials you're going to be digitizing and to think about what your community is likely to bring. Again, you also need to consider the expertise of your staff and the volunteers that you'll have on hand. And so do you have enough people who are comfortable with cameras to staff an entire day of digitizing at a camera stand? And so remember that this is an event, then people might not move through your space in as orderly a fashion as maybe you're hoping them to, and things might get a little hectic, depending, wayfinding signs or not. And so if you do have only one photographer, they're at least going to need some breaks, and you'll need a backup or two for people who are doing the digitization. And then on the other hand, what should you do if someone brings an item that's out of scope for your equipment? And so again, like that man in the costume that we mentioned earlier, there might be other options that you can use. And so for instance, if someone brings a book and you only have a scanner for digitization that's only good for flat materials, perhaps you can have someone taking snapshots of the event who can simply take a picture of that person with their book and document it that way. And so thinking about the tools to select, maybe it will be more logical and efficient to have only scanners at your community scanning day. Or perhaps if you have the resources, maybe you can have both a scanner and a digital camera on hand. And so this might start to sound elaborate, and I'm sure you can imagine the rabbit holes you can go down thinking about how you can digitize materials. Or it might also be beyond the budget that you have for your event. But the good news is that there's also inexpensive ways to use tablets or smartphones for a scanning day. And so there's nothing wrong with being resourceful and using what you have on hand and likely already know how to use. And we know that, if you're using your smartphone, it certainly is probably the most affordable option for you. I do want to mention a quick thing, though, about budgeting. And one thing is that there is a grant that's offered by the NHPRC, or the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, that's devoted to public engagement with historical records. And so if you're interested in learning more about this grant, I provided you with a link to it at the end of our presentation today, and it's also on the resource list that's been emailed out to you. And so you'll be able to see that with the materials that you're able to get from this webinar. And so I've mentioned that we have 3 general ways to digitize the materials that people are bringing. And so they are, first, actual scanning on a flatbed scanner. Second, photographing items with a DSLR camera and a camera stand. Or third, using a more DIY approach, using, perhaps a tablet and a stand. And so we're going to go through over the next slides. We're going to take a brief look at each type and then weigh the pros and cons of these different kinds of, using these different kinds of technologies. And so if you're focusing on photographic prints and documents for your scanning day, a scanner, a flatbed scanner, can really be a really great option for you. And so these can be fairly affordable, depending on, the type of resolution you're looking for and things like that. And we know that they do a great job on stable flat media. These are also good for slide scanning as well, with the addition of any accessories like a slide holder. And so we're going to take a look at those on our next slide coming up. In general, you can get a good quality flatbed scanner for several $100s. When considering your scanners, you're going to want to think about the maximum DPI that they can achieve and the total size of the scanning surface. And so I think that 300 PPI or DPI would do well for a community scanning day. But if you do want to go with a higher resolution, you have to keep in mind the intended end product that you're going to have. So meaning the file size that will result from scanning at a higher resolution, and the fact that, as I'm sure you all are aware, the higher the PPI or DPI, the higher the resolution, the longer the scan process takes, and the more digital storage that you're going to need to save these materials. And so if you're going for 300 DPI, scanners will do a great job and they'll do it at a decent speed. Also remember that you want to avoid crushing any book spines or any kind of three-dimensional aspect of an object that you're scanning. And also that the item that you're scanning must come into contact with the glass scanning surface. And so because of that, we know that scanners really are specialty tools best reserved for certain types of flat, stable media and not necessarily books or items that have any kind of three-dimensional component. As I mentioned earlier, one major pro for scanners is their ability to scan slides. And so we know that slides can be a really common thing that people want to scan, and there's a couple ways that you can go about it. And so first you can purchase a slide holder and use this to securely handle your slides and scan several slides at once. And so these are affordable and usually can be purchased on Amazon for around $20. As a pro tip, you can always purchase two. And so then you can scan one and then load the other and have kind of a nice interchange going on. You can see an image of that slide holder here on the left image on your screen. On the second image that we see here on the right, you'll see a desktop slide scanner. And so here with this type of equipment, you insert your slides one by one where they're scanned and then reformatted into a digital file. And so the one that we see here is a bit of an older version. Oops, sorry, wrong button there. Let me get to the right place. Sorry about that. So the one that we see here, it's a bit of an older version. But the scanners that you can purchase today, they provide a high bit depth, which results in a faithful color quality that it's capturing from your slides. And it also allows scanning at high DPI, which provides excellent image resolution. And so if you're using a piece of equipment like this, typically the scans are stored on an SD card or an external drive that then can be uploaded to more permanent and preservation-friendly digital storage. Slide scanners such as these, they usually cost around $200 and can be a good investment if you have a large number of slides in your collection to scan. And so thinking about the second option you can use for your scanning setup is to use a digital camera that can capture high quality images. And so using a digital camera, that's the way that our own imaging department at NEDCC digitizes items, albeit with a variety of very technical cameras, setups, and software that they use. And so as you can imagine, there's a big range of prices and specifications for digital cameras as opposed to scanners. And honestly, if we get into the technical specifications of DSLR cameras, it's a little bit beyond the scope of our webinar today and of preparing for a community scanning day. But we do know that a decent camera can cost several $100s. And if you're thinking about making an investment such as this might be a good option if you'd like to make a more permanent investment in your digital preservation capabilities. And so remember that if you're using a camera such as this, it needs to be steadied. And so like you see here, you'll have the additional expense of a camera stand or a tripod, along with a consistent light source that will be used while you're taking photographs. Once you do have everything set up though, image capture can be done fairly rapidly by tethering your camera directly to your computer. And so doing that, you can see a live feed of the shoot on your computer, as well as snap pictures from your desktop, and then have your files automatically sent to the computer. And so again, thinking of a setup like this, it might be a little bit more robust than what you need for a community event where you're aiming to capture your items at 300 DPI. But a camera setup will offer the flexibility to capture different media types and a lot of convenience down the road. And so, for instance, if you were looking to digitize, asking people to bring scrapbooks or heirlooms, anything that has that, the book or a three-dimensional aspect to it, digital camera would be a much better tool to use. And as I mentioned, since this can be much more of an investment, it can be a way to think about, okay, how many uses will I get out of this? Will I be able to, have my scanning day be as maybe the impetus for kicking off more digital projects in the future? I mentioned the need for a camera stand for your digital photo or camera. And so again, this will be an additional expense. But like I said, you can get a lot of use out of this equipment. And so here in this photo that we see here, we kind of have a whole setup here. We have an additional piece of equipment used for reading 35mm slides, which you can see in this kind of, I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but it's this white piece of equipment right here. And so with everything together, we have our camera, we have our light source, we have our slide reader. It's tethered directly to our computer. This is getting to be a very good setup, but it's also very complex and extensive in addition to learning how to use all of it directly and potentially have any kind of volunteers who might be, leading your scanning. And so those are other aspects to think about. Do you need something that's easier to transport, something you feel more comfortable having out in public, something that's a little bit more straightforward for your volunteers to learn and understand? All things to kind of take into consideration. And again, don't think about the light source that you will need for a digital camera. And so lights can be quite low tech. And so you can use clip-on lamps or regular light bulbs, or again, you can invest in a high-tech setup and have a high-tech attachment like we see here on the right image. And so the key for having your light source is to have even light over the surface of the item that you're digitizing. Again, this requires some expertise to gauge, as does correcting for color. And so again, this might be too much tech for a community scanning day, but this could be the launch pad, as I mentioned, for further digitization projects. And it's always nice to have the option, if you have the interest and the expertise, to use this kind of equipment. But, moving from there, we can also simply use what we have on hand. And so, again, I think we learned a lot about this during the pandemic. We know that our phones and our tablets can serve as powerful imaging tools. And so a phone and a tablet, along with an all-in-one stand, can also serve as an extremely portable scanning rig. And so if you're going out into the field, maybe, or out into your community for a community scanning day, this could really be a great option for you. The stand that we see here in this slide, it holds a tablet steady over an item that then is placed on the base. And you can see that small arm there on the bottom is a built-in LED light source. However, as we know, if you've taken photos with your tablet or your smartphone, you know that at times they can be a little awkward, or usually, our hands are unsteady, they move a little while we're taking our photographs. And so there are remote clickers that you can purchase that allow you to take photos without actually touching the screen on your camera or tablet. And also, this is something that I learned about recently. The headphones that come with Apple products, they usually have the same functionality as being like kind of a remote clicker when you press the volume button on the cord. This is something that I was not aware of until recently. And so that is a way that you can, be hands-free and not touch your tablet when you're taking your photographs. Color fidelity and image resolution, of course, will be two other factors to consider when using more DIY tools such as your phone or a tablet to capture images. And another thing to think about is getting your photographs off the tablet and then into your file organization system. And so you want to make sure to have a plan for this so you don't lose any information or the connection to the contributor of the item that you photographed. So I know this is a lot of information. Like I said, we'll have some time for questions. And so thinking about access and delivery, we're just going to go ahead and move on to this. So now we have a plan for our day and we've determined our actual method of digitization. And so the next step is how to manage the newly created digital content that you've made. And so to make your content readily available, discoverable, and usable, you need to give some thoughts to the metadata that you'll be using. And so, with your scanning day, you'll have all this great information about the items that you've scanned, and that's going to be contained in the form that we discussed earlier. Again, you want to keep that information tied to the scanned object all the way through the process to make your files findable and interoperable. And so the easiest way to achieve this is to use the same standards that you use for the rest of your collections, or to establish some specifically for this project that you can use then into the future. And so we know that file naming and organization has a lot to do with this process. And so you want to make sure that anyone who's organizing your scanned files really is on the same page. Again, this is a really great moment to, have those written instructions that say exactly what your file naming conventions are, how your folders will be organized, what you will be putting in them, just really making sure everything is organized and clear. Thinking about, you know what kind of information you want to gather on your end, thinking about intellectual control and how you're going to be storing these materials. But then also think about what do you want to make available specifically to your user, so people who will be accessing these files later in the future. Of course, they don't need to know the personal information of the person who brought in the item to scan, but you might choose a select few fields that are appropriate to display for all your scanned items, like the title, the date, maybe general subject keywords, the original format of the item, and of course, a unique identifier. And so, having that information will help you put together everything that you need on your intended platform to display these materials. You might even be able to structure your form in a way that allows you to easily attach the story or the context right to the file. And so just make sure that you don't include anything in that that shouldn't be accessible to the public. We're going to dive into rights and privacy concerns in just a moment. To do all this, you can use a familiar metadata schema, like the Dublin Core that you might be using for your existing digital collections, or any kind of control vocabulary tagging if you use a more open access platform, say like Flickr or something like that. And so thinking about organizing and describing our new digital files in a way that makes them both findable and usable, we also need to think about saving and storing these files and doing our part as good stewards of collections. And so this slide here is a reminder of the difference between digitization for preservation and digital preservation. And so if you look at Conway's two definitions here on the slide, you also see that they have a key element in common, and that is sustainability. And so Conway stipulates that digitization for preservation involves the creation of digital objects worthy of long-term preservation. And so the activities associated with the creation of those digital objects are also activities that are central to digital preservation. And so again, thinking about that selecting that we were talking about at the beginning, the choices that we make when selecting materials for digitization, capturing them digitally, describing them with metadata, and then packaging them for delivery to users, these choices determine our ability to preserve the resulting digital objects that we're creating. And so again, this might be a little higher level than what we're really expecting from a community scanning day, but that's okay. It does serve as foundation for good practice in digital preservation. And now that we've created a new digital collection with our community scanning day, we really want to be able to take care of it. And so what I'd like to emphasize here is that the community is investing their time in getting things digitized. And so as hosts of the scanning day, we really should be responsible stewards of these collections, just as we are with other materials in our archives. And so for digital storage, we take a fairly simple approach. And that's one that's quite effective and easy to remember. And you all may already be familiar with this. And so depending on your goals for the collection, you can choose to adopt the 3-2-1 rule. And so that is 3 copies of your files on 2 different types of storage media with 1 copy offsite. And so we recently did a workshop in Vermont, and a participant mentioned that she backs up her digital collections at her organization, which I think was a historical society. She backs those materials up on a hard drive and then takes that home with her. And so that can be a potential option and something that you can do to, have that, 2 different types of storage media and 1 copy offsite. We know there's multiple copies here, some on a local server, and then there's some on the hard disk. And so that can be a good idea for a small organization. Another thing to think of, though, is storage on the cloud, which can also count as storage at a separate geographic location. And so as we know, the cloud is truly a mass of servers that's located at a single site, and it's likely that that location is not close by to where you are. And so our goal here with this kind of storage is to have a backup at a separate location. So if anything happens to your building, or if there's a regional disaster of any kind that occurs, your materials exist somewhere else that's not affected. Moving on to think about discovery tools, there's a variety to make your content accessible. And so I suggest using any sort of digital content management system that you may already have. But if you don't have one of those available, I chose Boston Public Library's Flickr account here for this slide because it's a great example of using a freely available, user-friendly platform to make digital content available to users. We know that Flickr also has an easy-to-use rights management tool, and you can pretty much select the level of permissions that you want while you're uploading and for accessing the files. And so this can be a really nice option to maintain that intellectual control over your new digital content if you don't already have a content management system. And then last, after we have done all this work, you want to make sure that your users know about your digital collections. And so you want to promote those collections through your social media. And that whole process can be more efficient if the discovery tool that you're using, so your content management system or your open source tool like Flickr, plays nicely with social media platforms. And so by that, I mean that you can link or repost fairly easily, while also maintaining those use restrictions that you have in place for the digital content. Again, you can also target your promotion to users who you think would like to use it. And so you can always let community groups or any educators that you work with know about the collections. And so just quickly today, I know we're getting toward the end of the hour here, so we're going to wrap up with a quick overview of rights. And so when hosting your community scanning day, it's important to decide ahead of time what types of materials you're allowing again, and to make those perimeters clear to your participants. And so one more aspect to make participants aware of is the rights and restrictions that you're going to have in place. And so one major restriction that we know of is commercially produced material or any work subject to copyright. And so you would get into tricky territory if someone, for instance, brought a piece of sheet music or a poem written by someone else. And so it's best to limit your digitization to original items. Additionally, commercial works are often readily available elsewhere. And so you want to encourage your participants to bring in those personal items and spend the time they have for digitizing things that are special and unique to them. There still will be concerns about rights, however, on the part of your institution. And so, if you've accepted donated materials for archives and manuscript and the like, you probably already have a standardized policy or pre-written statements about rights and use. And so using these for your scanning day and then being prepared to explain them and having those notices available for participants is a really good thing to have on hand. This is where to avoid statements, though, default statements like all rights reserved. And so it's helpful for both your institution and your users to have really clear statements of responsibility. As far as making your new digital content available and accessible, we know that OCLC research staff, with input from speakers and advisors, have drafted a reasonable approach to balancing risk and access when making collections of unpublished materials accessible online. And so again, from that beginning, we want to select collections wisely. And so this is circling back around to setting those clear guidelines of what can and cannot be digitized at your event. But as we know, rights are really confusing. And though your community might not quite understand what types of things are, a good candidate for digitization, that might not be clear to them as well. And so to make that more clear, it helps to give them examples like the ones that we discussed at the beginning. So, like photographs or paper-based materials, but then also keep an eye on the actual content that's coming throughout the day. Once your collections are available online, you want to provide what's called a takedown policy statement and a disclaimer to users. And so in other words, make compliance easy if a user raises an objection to anything that you've posted. And so you can see information here on this OCLC. They'll have some information about exactly this well-intentioned practice and how to have a takedown policy and make any disclaimers that you might need to post on your website. One thing that you need to remember, as I'm sure you're aware, is that digital dissemination is wide and far-reaching. And so information that's exposed to a single viewer in a gallery is not really the same as information exposed on a public website. And so if you see any of the above categories that we see here, you're going to want to keep that information private. I'd also add any kind of financial information to this list just to be safe. And so, you're hopefully someone's not going to bring in their checkbook or anything that has, a modern checking account number on it. But really, just in case you do, make sure you're redacting all that kind of information. And so to do that and cover your bases here, it's a really good idea to have a release form alongside your scanning form. And so this is a great thing to have on hand at the registration and welcome station and could be available to all your participants, not just those who are contributing content, but if you do choose to document the day in itself by taking any photos, it's good to have permission from the people who are there and who might be captured in those photos, especially if there are any children present. And so again, this form is from the Mass Memories Roadshow. And it combines all these registration pieces into one. And so the top part is registration for the event. And then the box part has both an event photo release and a rights statement for anything that they brought for digitization. Okay, so now we have two forms, and it might seem like this all might take a lot of time to explain or to have people fill out. But I think that this is a good thing. It gives you really the opportunity to interact with your community and welcome them into your community scanning day space. It also allows you to set the pace for the day. And so as we know, digitization is not all that fast, and there are a few processes to keep track of throughout. So again, that file naming and organization after scanning. And you want your staff and volunteers to be able to devote the time that they need to talk with contributors and scanning their items. One thing to note in particular about this form is that Mass Memories Roadshow puts the statements on this form in plain language. And so there's no legalese here or need for complex terms, something that's just really straightforward and easy to understand. And so, we're pretty much right at the top of the hour, but I'm happy to stay after and answer any questions that you might have. But here we have a couple of references and resources for further reading. And so, right about now, you might be thinking that, oh God, I need a larger budget for this, or maybe you don't have a budget to work with at all. And so I mentioned this briefly before, the NHPRC, or the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, they offer a grant that can be used to, this is quoted on their website, collect primary source material from people through public gatherings and sponsor discussions or websites about the results. And so you can see that first link up at the top left here on the screen. And then I've also included a link here to 2 guidebooks that can be followed for creating your community scanning day. And so that's the Mass Memories Roadshow handbook that I referred to during the webinar. And then I also want to call attention to ROPA, which is the Roadmap for Participatory Archiving. And so both of these were created by UMass Boston. And they really have they're excellent sources to follow for creating your community scanning day. The Mass Memories Roadshow handbook, they have really step-by-step instructions, and they also have templates for those forms that we discussed today. And then ROPA has really great ways to think about, building inclusivity and, cultural acceptance when you're hosting an event like this. And so both of these will be available in the handout that Sarah will email to you after our event today. So I apologize, I went right to the end of the hour, but I will turn on my camera here. And as I mentioned, I'm happy to stay on for, 10 minutes and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you, Stephanie. Hope that this is useful. Recommendations for transporting flatbed scanners without damage. That is a really good question. I don't have anything right off the top of my head. I can think of, ways of securing things. So, placing things in a box, wrapping them so they're protected. But as we know, scanners, they can be fragile, and the materials that are inside them can be, especially fragile to any kind of vibration or things that might happen if you're driving with them somewhere. I'll do some research on that, and can also check in with our imaging department and see if they have some specific recommendations for that. The thing I think of off the top of my head is placing in a box, hard luggage with foam inside. There you go. That's a great one, Stephanie. Yeah, something that where it is, it definitely has protective material around it like foam or bubble wrap. Securing that lid down. So maybe, after you put foam, you want to tie it with linen ties or do something like that to make sure that things aren't wobbling around. I love that suggestion of hard luggage because, as we know, things knock around, and a box can be protective, but hard luggage might be even better. So thanks for that, Stephanie. Has anyone here hosted a community scanning day in the past, or done anything like that before?
This is John with the Missouri State Archives. We
Hi,
did
John.
several years ago in something that's called the Great Missouri Treasure Hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And we lost 2 scanners in that project. That's why I asked that question. And they actually were in their original boxes. And still somehow the folks that were taking them to the sites, I think they broke the glass on one, and actually the old ones used to have a lock on them and the new ones don't. And they forgot to lock it, and it, like you said, the vibration or something damaged it to where it was completely inoperable. We actually took the glass out of that one and put in the other one. But yeah, I know that was our biggest problem we actually had with something like that.
Well, that's good to know, because it's good to hear other people's experience, and knowing that you were bringing these materials around to a lot of different organizations, and so now it might be something where it might be worth investing in one of those tablet stands, something that, you know, if you are moving things around, thinking about that fragility of the scanners, and that it might be worthwhile to have a tablet stand where you're not putting that equipment into that position, because I'm sure you were using that as well at your organizations for digitization projects you were working on and things like that. And so so that might be something to consider if you are going to be going out into communities, to think about, you know, is it worthwhile to bring a scanner? Would it be better to have a different kind of setup that might be less likely to break? Mm-hmm. I'll move on to my last slide here. I am happy to stay here a few more minutes, but just want to say thank you and give you some contact information for NEDCC. And so, you know, you're welcome to contact us with any kind of preservation questions you have or issues you might be facing at your organization. You can see our email and our phone number here. Sarah's going to be sending you the link to the evaluation form, and so we'd love to hear what you thought. And we also have our social media channels here, and so you can sign up for our e-newsletter. You can hear about the different public kind of webinars that we have at NEDCC. And we also have our social media pages. I especially like our Instagram page. We have some good social media stuff going on too. So.
Thanks, Eli. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but
Great.
Feel free, if you have any other questions, just to stick around and we can do those.
Great. And that's great to hear, John. I'm glad that we can, you know, make sure